While Spain kept a tight hold on much of Central and South America, North America was a different story. In the mid-1700s, two of Europe's heavyweights jockeyed for position to become North America's top dog, the empires of France and Great Britain. Britain's land claims bumped up against the much larger land claims of France. While Britain controlled a sliver of land on the east coast of North America, France had claimed the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley, including the land extending as far west as the Rocky Mountains. Oh, let's not forget, large portions of Canada too. Ooh la la. Both empires, the British and the French, knew what it would take to cement themselves as heavyweight champion of Europe. Land, and lots of it. France began constructing forts closer and closer to the British 13 colonies. They were eager beavers to sink their teeth deeper into the fur trade within the Ohio country. At the same time, England decided it was their time to push west beyond the Appalachian Mountains and into, you guessed it, the very same Ohio country. Maybe they could sink their teeth into the fur trade too. Jolly good. Tensions between two of Europe's most powerful empires were on the rise. But no reason to fight, right? To complicate matters, some British colonists began to move their way into the Ohio country. Hey, just because the land was claimed by France, well, that doesn't mean any French people were actually living there. But France decided it may be best to start building some forts in case the British got things twisted. Enter a young 21-year-old British colonel named... Anyone? British colonel from Virginia? Yes, George Washington. George Washington marched a force of British soldiers into the wilds of what is now western Pennsylvania in May of 1754. His mission was to convince the French to stop building forts and leave the Ohio country. When the French responded with a big fat no, or in French, a big fat non, after all, the French had claimed the land first. But not liking that answer, Washington did what any person would do. He launched an early morning sneak attack, killing the French as they slept. Okay, maybe that's not what any person would do. The ambush on the sleeping French ended with the capture and questioning of the French leader. As the French leader was explaining that their mission was peaceful, a Native American with Washington, known as Half King, struck the Frenchman with a hatchet, murdered him, then scalped him on the spot. Wait, what? You can't just... Oh, it's on now. You know sparks have to fly. Hey, slow down, Colonel. You don't want to start a war, do you? The young British Colonel Washington wanted to make sure people would remember his name. The sneak attack caused things to heat up between France and Great Britain, from North America to Europe, from Europe all the way to India. Could a world war be brewing? The British ordered their young colonel to take a return trip to the Ohio country in June of 1754. This time he was charged with building a fort. The fort would serve as headquarters just in case the French still had a beef over that little sneak attack incident the month before. The fort would be called Fort Necessity. Washington ordered the fort to be built in an area of low ground. Mr. Colonel Washington, sir. Sir, what if it happens to rain? Don't question me. I'm a colonel, not to mention a surveyor. I know what I'm doing. Get back to work. I suppose it went something like that. Just as the British suspected, the French counterattack finally arrived. But with a torrential downpour of rain. It rained and it rained. The entire fort flooded, making Washington's British soldiers sitting ducks. As men fell around him, the colonel knew his goose was cooked. Washington surrendered, and his men, humiliated, embarrassed, and soaking wet, were allowed to skedaddle back to the British colony of Virginia. Does this mean the young British Colonel, George Washington, was already washed up? Finally finished messing with the French? I will answer this one for you in French. Absolutely no. In fact, after his embarrassing defeat at Fort Necessity, Washington said, "I have heard the bullets whistle. Believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Okay, Colonel Washington, but I bet you wish you had also heard someone tell you to not build a fort on low ground. Washington's big chance to prove himself came. Well, his third big chance. He was asked to join his super cool idol, British General Edward Braddock. Now, this is the kind of guy Washington hoped to become one day. Okay, I know what you're wondering, and the answer is yes. This is the same Braddock for whom Braddock Road and Braddock Road Metro Station are named. You may have noticed a cannon on Braddock Road. It was left behind as the British Army headed out on their long march to western Pennsylvania and the Ohio country. Washington was so happy to be allowed to tag along with big bad General Braddock. Braddock will show Washington just how to deal with those pesky French and their meddlesome Native American allies. The new mission was simple: head an enormous British force to a French fort located near what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and destroy it. The French fort was called Fort Duquesne. Braddock marched a 4-mile-long column of soldiers through 100 miles of the Ohio country's swamps, steep mountains, and dense forests. The forest was so thick that 300 axemen were used to clear the way. It took nearly a month for Braddock's massive force to get within smelling distance of Fort Duquesne. Hopes were high. The men were feeling good. Braddock was confident. Washington was, well, happy. Let's go. This was gonna be easy. Suddenly, the British found that they had walked directly into a trap. Native Americans fired from the left. Native Americans fired from the right. The French fired from in front. The British, with their bright red uniforms, stood out like sore thumbs and dropped like flies. Many tried to run, but Braddock and his officers demanded that they stand firm and fight. Easy for you to say, Mr. General. You see, it was against the rules of battle to target an officer. Many more soldiers had had enough and began to run. But with the approaching British soldiers from the rear, they found they were boxed in. There was no escape. It was a mess. General Braddock scolded his men, "Stand and fight like men." Braddock was hit. Oops, maybe somebody didn't know the rules. Washington's idol died a short time later. In a matter of minutes, the British had lost their general. They had lost the entire battle. As for Washington, this was strike three for him against the French. This was just the beginning of a conflict between Britain and France that truly did become a world war. It involved fighting in North America, Europe, even as far away as India in Asia. And to think, a young colonel had started it all with a teeny-weeny sneak attack. The conflict became known as the 7 Years' War. Anyone care to guess how long it lasted? 9 years? I know, strange, huh? Oh well, at least the fighting between France and Great Britain in North America is called the French and Indian War. Still confused? Well, it was the French and their Native American allies, mainly the Huron, versus the British and their Native American allies, mainly Iroquois. Remember them? See? French and Indian War. Although the war started out rough for the British, they would actually defeat their number one rival, their main nemesis, their biggest foe, their chief adversary, their arch enemy, France. By 1763, a treaty was signed ending the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. The treaty that ended the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, is called the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Pay attention to the year. There have been no less than 30 Treaty of Parises in history. Winning the war changed quite a few things in the world. But as for North America, it meant the British would take control of most of Canada and all of the lands from the Appalachian Mountains out to the Mississippi River. Au revoir, France. Yes, Great Britain ended up with more land, the heavyweight champion of North America. But it came at a tremendous financial cost. Wars are expensive, and Britain had to borrow money to win. By the end of the war, Britain was over 122 million British pounds in debt. Oh, never matter. At least finally, those colonists from the 13 colonies can move into the Ohio country. I mean, after all, many of these British colonists had fought for the right to move there. But I suppose they should have asked someone else other than the French for the land, like the people who had called that land home for tens of thousands of years, Native Americans. As more and more settlers moved from the 13 British colonies into the Ohio country, a Native American chief named Chief Pontiac wasn't going to have it. Chief Pontiac led several raids on the invading colonists. In all, 2,000 colonists were killed or captured. 4,000 were forced to flee the newly gained British lands. The British king, King George III, knew what he must do. He took out a map and drew a line, calling it the Proclamation Line of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 said that British colonists were not allowed to enter the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. This land would belong to the Native Americans. That would keep his loyal British subjects safe. There, problem solved. Long live the king. But King George III had one more problem to take care of. That enormous debt. Thought King George III. How can I place some money back into Great Britain's bank account? Aha! By George, I think I've got it. I will just put a small tax on some goods sold in the American colonies. After all, we, Great Britain, fought that war to protect our British colonists in the 13 colonies from those dastardly Frenchies. They'll be delighted to pay. Problem solved?